Digital Marketing Masters Podcast. Your host, Matt Rouse, talks to Dan Friker
about the future of work. Future of work. Future of work.
Welcome back, everybody, to Digital Marketing Masters. I'm your host, Matt Rouse, and today I have Dan. Is it Friker or Fricker? I was like Fricker. All right, yes. I watched you on another show, and I think the guy pronounced it two different ways, and it kind of confused me.
That's probably that. With the last name of Fricker, this is not the first time someone's made fun or mispronounced my last name.
The thing that really caught my eye was talking about kind of digital futurism, right? What is the future of work? So we're going to talk about that. Do you want to just give like a one breath intro to who you are, and then we can get straight into it?
Sure. My name is Dan Friker, undergraduate degree and a graduate degree from the University of Minnesota. I currently sit on the career advisory board for the College of Science and Engineering. So all those physicists, astrophysicists, chemists. But it has been a passion of mine around the changing world of work. And in particular, based on my kind of unique background, the implications of rising technologies on all sorts of workers, from blue collar to black collar to white collar and everything in between. And quite frankly, how not just Fortune 100 companies, but even small, medium-sized businesses are going about trying to find talent and skills.
Things, they are changing.
Yeah.
I've been working on the new version of the book, Will AI Take My Job? So I've been also, trying to take in all the new stuff as quickly as I can. As actually on the previous episode, 265 with Ethan Holland, he collects and organizes and summarizes all the news about AI. And in the last few years, he's collected, I think it's 23,000 AI links and summaries. So you can imagine how hard it is to keep up.
Yes.
Dan, the first thing I wanted to ask you is, before the show, we were talking about a bit about how AI is going to affect HR and the future of work, not just work itself, but actually staffing. So I guess my first question is, what do you think is going to change in HR in the short term?
Well, I think you can see a couple of things, and you can look to certain places in the world for a little bit of insight, if you will, some little harbingers of what's to come, right? So I was recently in Tokyo, and one of the things that I find striking straight away is when you have a country with an aging population and you have relatively still restrictive controls in terms of how talent can actually migrate into the country, right? You won't see anyone selling you a newspaper, assuming that someone's actually, reading newspapers these days. But like, you see the amount of like vending machines that will sell things that will blow your mind, right? And it's this really interesting kind of culture around. There's a lot of reverence around certain things like calligraphy. I still believe that they are the largest users of fax machines. No joke, complete serious. But yet also have some of the most sophisticated HR systems that I've ever seen. You also, though, have interesting harbingers when you take a look at, the Indian, the Malaysian, the Singaporean, and even some of the Latin American markets, where, and studies have shown that younger workers today are much more comfortable using mobile technologies, their smart device, to not just search for jobs, but to actually accept jobs. Right. So like in the West, where we kind of evolved, having things like PCs and whatnot. A lot of my Indian friends still find it hilarious that you can go to New York and still only half the restaurants or whatever have tap and pay. Like when they see someone pull out a credit card, they laugh. They're like, oh, you still use those. Right. So the digital literacy in certain countries, I would actually argue, are possibly even a couple of years further along than you would see, certainly in the US, maybe slightly Canada as well, because if you are now able, and these are examples that I have found right now today, right, where people aren't just getting selected based on their mobile device app and leveraging some of these new, AI, recruiting tools. And then on the back end, companies are able to do a better job at not only hiring talent, but they have a way on the back end to start sorting that talent in a different way, right? So now you're creating this kind of infinity ecosystem of talent. And instead of doing annual reviews annually, you can now do them in an iterative way. Because in the past, if labor up and leaves your organization, you talk about attrition. You can talk about people leaving. Now you can actually detect it before it happens. Are people getting upset because of their compensation? Are they upset because of benefits? Are they upset because of their shift? A manager? Now you can actually start proactively addressing these issues before people essentially vote with their feet. Right. So you can see these examples that are now several years in advance. And then I look to US examples and even talk to several CHROs. And it's like they're simultaneously starting to use AI for writing, job descriptions, which is great. But then you also you're not utilizing some of the AI tools effectively that are coming out with some of the most common applicant tracking systems and vendor management systems that you have out there today.
Right.
So
CHRO is Chief
Human Resource Officer.
Yeah,
Yes.
I found that wasn't a very common term. When I first saw it, I tried to type it into Google and it just keeps saying Chrome. And I'm like, no, I want CHRO. And it's like, Chrome? Stop it, Google. I know what you're doing. All right. So we had been talking about this, and I think this is an interesting idea. So and this is my understanding of how it works in let's say medium-sized corporations right now, is the HR manager has previous job listings. So they take that and they put it into the AI, and then they say, this is the new differences in the job that we're hiring for now. Mm-hmm. So the AI is helping to write the job description.
Correct.
And then they upload it to a job, posting place or whatever it is that they're going to hire through. And then that AI is sorting through the candidates and the systems to figure out who it's going to surface the job to show in the first place.
Correct.
The candidates are using the AI to write their resume.
A percentage of them.
So
you're having a derivative of people starting to write. So again, right there, you're starting to see the have and have-nots. But carry on.
Fairly soon, you're going to have people actually have the system go apply for the jobs for them.
Correct.
And then in the interview process, a lot of times HR reps are using the AI to write the interview questions.
Correct.
And then you've got AI systems that give the person being interviewed live notes while they're being interviewed over Zoom or something, right? It helps them come up with answers to questions live while they're on the call.
Correct.
And then you're using an AI system to go through all the candidate resumes and interview responses and everything and kind of weed out candidates. So there's a lot of AI involved in this process already.
There's elements of AI, but there is an efficiency and success paradox.
Right.
And the paradox is, yes, you can have AI right now. You can LinkedIn, you can hit easy apply, and you can probably submit to hundreds of positions right now today, or certainly this week, right? That is a very efficient thing to do, right? However, is that really a successful outcome? LinkedIn themselves says that 95% of easy applied don't even get a response.
Right.
So it only has a 5% success rate. What is even more interesting, because I'm old, and so so when you look at I'm going to give you a quick history lesson to kind of bring you up to speed of where we are today, right? Because the paradox is we're actually seeing entropy and efficiency of being able to link people with organizations that want to hire them, right? And that doesn't make sense because they're like, wait a minute, with all these systems, with all these new versions of ChatGPT, like we should be seeing more efficiency. And I think we will get there, to be clear. But we're at this weird inflection point because in the 90s, you had major companies, and certainly the major staffing companies, which I came from one, you had these kind of traditional client server databases. And those databases were, really built off of decades of people walking through a storefront and essentially human beings surveying their skills, right? So in the 90s and early 2000s, that was actually proprietary. In fact, you would sell essentially like we have a better database of candidates in this market with these skills versus our competitors. It was the late 90s, early 2000s that you saw the rise of essentially job boards, your Gen 1s, Monsters, Career Builders, that sort of thing. And that started to level the playing field in a big way, right? Not only was it significantly cheaper, but it gave companies access to talent pools themselves versus actually, going out in the marketplace and utilizing, one of the big staffing companies. And what you saw was the number of placements per recruiter essentially go up, right? So certain, white collar, positions, you try to benchmark like 4 placements per month, for example. There's going to be different numbers for different types of skills. You saw those, continually go up. And then they peaked because instead of finding that needle in a haystack, now you're just getting flooded with needles to find the best needle.
This voiceover used to be done by a human, but now it is synthetic. Ooh la la. If you want to know if your job or business is safe from disruption, read Matt's new book, Will AI Take My Job? Predictions about AI in corporations, small business, and the workplace. Available now on Amazon. Trust me, it'll be worth it.
Right.
I think one person that explains this the best is actually a gentleman named Tony Saldana. He wrote a great book basically talking about why business transformations fail, right? The example that he uses is really talking about the retail space, about how 2018 in the United States, you saw more companies go out of business. In 2018, it was the high water mark, right? And it was because retailers and executives at retailers like Sears, they saw the rise of e-commerce come in the 90s. They saw it in the early 2000s. But it really comes down to those that adopted new strategies and adapted those strategies inside their organization, like your Walmarts, right? That is using AI to streamline their supply chain so that they can provide products, I think 5 to 10,000 products within a 5-mile radius of a Walmart store, if I remember the Wall Street Journal article correctly, so that they can essentially do same-day delivery, and compete. So you're seeing those companies adapt, and those that don't get lapped. And 2018 is when they essentially went out of business, right? And then right now you're seeing that with AI and HR. All these new tools that can do different little bits. So your earlier comments were completely accurate. AI to write your resume, AI to write the job description, AI functionality in a lot of these kind of back-end HR systems. But we're not there in terms of truly linking people with positions.
Yeah.
So,
well, you know what I think is another issue, and this happens everywhere that I go talk about AI, I see the same thing. So what happens is you've got a very small number of early adopters who are very excellent at using the tools for productivity. And then you've got kind of a group of people who are kind of dabbling in it, and they're just kind of, I use it for this, I use it for that, but I don't really use it that much kind of thing, who are not getting a huge benefit out of it, but they're getting some benefit out of it. And then you've also got another small group of kind of naysayers who are like, anybody who uses this is an idiot, and AI's just a lying machine that is going to burn all the water in the world and whatever other BS that they're going to talk about, right? So, like, you've got these groups of people who are just, they're either not using it, or they're not using it to its potential, or they're against using it. And that is a larger percentage of the market than the people who are using tools to their advantage. So the net advantage is low because you have to look at it with all the other people who are not using it as part of the equation.
Again, but couldn't you make the same argument in e-commerce and retail in the 90s, in early 2000s?
Well, right. But in the early 2000s, you have to remember that they started doing things like data mining, which essentially was AI before Gen AI, right? And before large language models. They're doing data mining, and like SAP has a stopwatch on every single point all the way through the entire, chain of the ecosystem for their supply chain, all the way from, we know that there's going to be a hockey tournament in 3 months, so we need these jerseys to start now in Bangladesh of getting sewn, and here's the color codes for Nike, right? Like, I worked on those systems. I know how they work. And a lot of that was not just retail and e-commerce colliding. A lot of it was supply chain and delivery management.
Yeah, no. I'm smiling because I remember working on some SaaS forecast servers for a major retailer here in Minnesota. And it was crazy about how it could take all these different variables to create, staffing models for their stores based on the time of year, when Samsung was going to have a new product release. And,
Right.
like previously, this retailer was basically just allowing individual store managers to kind of staff their stores.
Right.
And if that store wasn't doing as well, maybe they just kind of purposely understaff it, but it was kind of that first iteration, if you will. Right. Now, Matt, I'll give you an example of something we talked about in the pre-show, which was healthcare. Right.
Right.
In grad school, and this is when we were trying to apply some data science to probably one of the most difficult staffing models you can do, which is staff in a hospital, right? And
Right.
think about it. Your hospital can go out of business if and you overstaff it, right?
Right.
Because like now it's like you've built this great
In the
model.
United States, it can.
Right, true.
Right.
Although
I don't think I've seen an overstaffed hospital ever in Canada. To be
right,
honest.
but that's the main point is that let's just say there's a financial incentive to make sure that the hospital is optimally staffed, right? And even down to some simple questions of like, do you have a full-time radiologist on staff, or do you essentially use an outsourced provider? Because if you're a major hospital in downtown Minneapolis, it probably makes sense. You have enough
Right.
volume to kind of handle that. But now you continue to go down that list. And I will tell you, we were using crazy, for the time, data science modeling to try to figure it out. And every time we were able to come close to it, how do you prepare for a major, snowstorm that hits and suddenly, there's more car
Right.
accidents, or if a plane crashes, or like these kind of black swan events. But those are real things that hospitals have to contend with, right? AI has the potential today to create these type of dynamic staffing models so that a company, if they're using AI to, let's say, create, new product development, they want to kind of pilot something new. Part of the challenge you have is, okay, do we have the talent to actually execute on that pilot or actually go to market? And in my theory is there are companies that are getting painfully close to being able to kind of connect the two, right?
There's definitely some problems with connecting the dots for a lot of industries right now.
Yes.
Disparate systems all over the place that don't talk to each other properly. And I think AI will bridge that gap, right? I mean, right now you can use AI with a virtual machine, open a terminal server, talk and work its way through some system that was written in the 80s. And it's been trained on that data, so it knows how to use those systems, right? It can use an old VT100 terminal or something. And from the staffing system as well. And I think we saw this kind of an example of this when kind of COVID lockdowns happened, is that nobody had Slack built into the system. Everything was drilled down to as quick, as fast, as easy as we can, as just in time as we can make it, because that's the cheapest. And then as soon as there's any disruption, it cascades failures down all the way through the system, right?
100%.
So it's like when you have a black swan event of, a giant car accident because the bridge collapsed or something. Well, now you don't have anybody there because there's no Slack in the system.
And that's, again, I think we're getting better, at least being able to provide some of the modeling to handle some of those talent logistics.
There could be some futuristic, scenario where, the AI systems are going through and they're saying, what is the chance of having an emergency based on all these other factors and all this other data that we've taken in? And it can say, well, there's a lot of crumbling infrastructure around, Twin Cities area. So we think it's likely that there's going to be a problem at some point in the next 6 months. So we better staff more people. Unfortunately, I did live there for a while, so I know that their infrastructure has some issues.
I was in grad school when the 35W bridge collapsed, so I'm
it's crazy, right? Getting back to the HR thing, and I think this is something I wanted to touch on again that we had talked about. I have no scientific backing for this. This is just my opinion. But if I'm a person who uses AI to write my resume for a job, and somebody used AI to write the job description,
correct,
the same correlations that happen in those systems would make it more likely for the person who applied for that job using AI to get the position by an AI checking for that thing, because it's using the same correlative data.
So,
right?
man, the concept that you just talked about, essentially being able to kind of see the back end, like all the Tableau executive. So you put a job out there, it's going to rank, based on several, algorithmic factors of like, okay, here are the top 10% of people that applied for this job.
Right.
So you're making such a this. I want to screen this to the heavens that like this is the implications for individuals that aren't adapting how they're going about their job search, or within organizations that are looking for talent, like how they need to kind of look at this a little bit differently. Because yes, it's going to give advantages to those that are using the latest AI tools, because they're going to rank really high, but you could be essentially ignoring some of the best talent because they're not using these tools.
Right. Well, now you have another problem also, which is bias starts to creep into your hiring practice based on the use of the systems, right? So 85% of paid ChatGPT users are men.
Yeah.
So now you've got 85% of men who have a resume that's more likely to be selected by an AI system because they wrote it with an AI system than women. So now you've got this already probably an imbalance in the men to female ratio in most industries, right? And then you've also got this factor now that we've got more men than women using AI to apply for jobs, right? As well as people who are generally more wealthy, first-time English language speakers, right? Languages, English as a first language speakers are more likely to be using AI. There's a whole bunch of factors. People in low-income areas generally don't use them. English as a second language generally don't use them, right? So now you're not only having that specific bias creep in, but it's like a bias built on top of another bias, right? So it's almost like exponential bias, which is terrible because you don't want to have that happen, because obviously, you're not selecting for the best candidate, as you were saying.
It is what the EU was trying to address. And I'm not going to comment, is it right, is it wrong? And just like I'm not going to comment about US.
But this is not my opinion about DEI or something.
Right.
This is a fact of these systems, right?
Correct.
It's not anything
and
about
I think
politics.
That's what, again, the spirit and intent what the EU was trying to do with the passage of their new AI laws as it relates to HR and hiring practices, which is, number one, they want organizations to actually document how they're using AI and what are some of those preventative measures to at least mitigate bias and potential discrimination in these tools. So in other words, document your process first. And then number two, like, what are those potential flaws? And then what are you doing to check to see, is your system actually, having unintended bias, right?
Yeah.
That, and you're going, in my humble opinion, you're going to say that in the US, you now have 15 states, and it will be interesting to see how many more states continue to kind of, put these similar kind of rules in place. Because, I mean, I don't think it's a controversial thing to say. In fact, I think it's just kind of a standard fact that, in most AI models, it's all predicated on, is your data, are you basing it off of good data? And is it biased or unbiased data, whether you know it or not? It could show up. It does show up. So,
well, I don't think there's any way to avoid bias in the scale of the data that gets entered into the systems, right? Because you can't check for it, because who's going to check a trillion pages of information? Like, nobody, right? And I mean, there's lots of good data that's checked, that's human checked and put into the systems. And I mean, they try to reduce bias post-training and all the other ways that they do that. But I think it kind of comes back to, I always think about this. I don't remember where this originally came from, but when they were having people try out to be a musician in a symphony, and they started putting the musician behind a curtain so that you couldn't see if they were male or female or black or white or whatever, then suddenly they started hiring way more female musicians.
Yeah.
Because there was a bias to thinking that male musicians were better by whoever the people who were choosing the musicians, right?
Well,
and it was the same as when they took the names off of resumes, right?
Correct. And I think, so Andrew Ng, who was, one of the founders of Google's, Brain, which essentially became their, AI project.
Right.
One of the case studies that he talks about is, some of those aha moments, not in a good way, was when they were saying, like, man is to, developer as woman is to homemaker. Like
Right.
that was the data they were getting back, right? And that's kind of when they started realizing, okay, there's bias here.
Right.
The computer was just basically running the algorithm to go, okay, we're going to go 2 up, 1 over, and this is the value associated with that particular role. Again, what are we doing to address it? And that onus on top of a flooded inbox of employee issues is what essentially HR departments are being, forced to contend with today. On top of changing employment laws, on top of, workforce challenges, on top of making sure that they're posting the right kind of job description based on what a department needs. I mean, this is there's so many reasons why, that we have inefficiency in this system today. Again, I think we're going to figure it out. It's the research that I'm in.
I mean, it's difficult, right? So let me ask you this. If in the staffing HR world, what do you think is the blind spot for most people? Like, what are they not seeing that's going to be important now or soon?
Oh, there's a lot. I'll give you an example. So last summer, I did a seminar. So I actually partnered with a company called Talent Edge AI, right? And Talent Edge AI is doing some really interesting things around, and the CEO of Talent Edge AI is actually someone that I worked very closely with when we worked together at Manpower Group. Her name is Raylene Gagnon. She was, let's just say, in so many respects, the right person at the right time because, she was heading up a group inside of Manpower Group that was looking at wage data and seeing kind of how talent was migrating to different places. I mean, in real time, she was able to kind of pick up on the migration of talent, like going from California to Texas and whatnot, and kind of using some really interesting things. Also taking a look at the differences in wage data. So where I'm going with this is, she now is with Talent Edge AI. And so we started looking at, okay, let's examine how you take like light industrial workers, manufacturing workers, like what are the skills that they have today? And then what are the skills that companies are starting to ask for? And then let's see if we can measure that delta.
Right.
And when that came back, I had multiple meetings with her to go, okay, did we do this wrong? Like this can't be accurate. And basically what we were seeing was an exponential increase in digital skills for light industrial workers, right? And initially the data didn't make sense, but, I'm here in the upper Midwest. And so I would meet with customers, meet with CHROs, meet with, VPs of production. And more what you're seeing is, of course, companies are buying capital equipment instead of needing 10 workers, they need 2. Because the machines are doing it all. But of course, now they're having to work on digital screens or, and, there's KPIs that are come out of it in terms of production, failure rates and everything else. There's Excel spreadsheets they have to contend with. Well, you're essentially taking, kind of minimum wage, lower wage workers and now saying in order to get this job, you have to have digital skills.
Right.
And even like things like around like fundamentals around data science, you're like, an allied worker,
But, well, I honestly found the same thing in my own research for the book is that there's an edge case of workers where they need to be not necessarily the absolute best worker, but they have to be the worker who also has the ability to solve the really, really weird, odd problems that come up. And the skills to work with the automation that's going to go into place. And if you have those 2 skills, as well as whatever the rest of the job is, you're the one who keeps your job.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, Darwin people get it wrong all the time. Darwin thinks, only the strongest survive. No, that's not what he said.
No, that's not what he said.
That adapt.
Right.
That's why we have the cockroach and not a Tyrannosaurus Rex. So, again.
I don't know. I got some chickens and they're like tiny dinosaurs.
Yeah.
You see them find a mouse or something, and you're like, man, I don't want to be a mouse when there's some giant dinosaur chickens around.
I mean, okay, but man, let's stay on something like that. Agribusiness. I'm in the upper Midwest.
Right. It's a tough time to be in the bird business, I'll tell you that.
Well, but one of the biggest challenges you have is from a workforce trend perspective, you are seeing a continuous migration kind of revert a little bit during COVID, but in a sense,
Mhm.
there's less and less people in rural America, or I would even say rural Canada for that matter as
Right.
well, migrating to more major metropolitan areas. And, if you look at the United States and your traditional kind of T in terms of where the vast majority of agribusinesses are, right? When I say T, it's, your North, South Dakota,
Right.
Minnesota, all the way down to like Kansas, northern Texas. When I started seeing at the University of Minnesota the utilization of data science around, okay, what are those optimal crops to grow,
Right.
within these marketplace? Well, now you have, I mean, this is public now, but like very quietly, John Deere acquired an AI company.
Right.
Why? Because these guys basically found this machine to, attach to the back of John Deere so that, it's looking at images of weeds and applying, weed killer and whatnot. So of course farmers can use less weed killer, optimize
Right.
their fertilizers and everything else. So now you have a bunch of automation data scientists, AI folks running around farms in ever increasing ways so that they can use less pesticides, not just, I mean, fertilizer costs continue to go up exponentially, but so you're using it more efficiently and applying it in such a way to get a better yield, right?
Right. Well, there's also like climate data and things like that are getting put into those systems, and then they're automatically putting the data into the farmer's system to say, this is how much you need to water. This
Correct.
is, this is coming up. This event might come up, as well as having the equipment be able to kind of run around itself in the fields. Like I know most of the large scale farming people that I know, which is some because I used to live in Alberta, they ride around in their tractor basically looking at an iPad all day.
Yep.
The tractor drives itself around the field. They don't drive it,
Correct. But still, when it comes time to harvest your yield, you got a small window.
Right.
And yes, either you're going to need seasonal talent to come in, or you need the truck drivers and everything else to kind of, I mean, and frankly, there's less and less people, in those particular areas. And yeah, I mean, I bring this example up because, I mean, Matt, because of your experience in Alberta, I live here in Minnesota. So I see it. And when I have conversations with folks in San Francisco or New York, they're just like, science and automation and farming, it's like more than you realize.
Yeah, it's
But
a lot. It's a lot.
so it helps to explain the data that we're seeing in light industrial workers, but it's moving up exponentially across the value chain. And that even speaks to what that McKinsey research paper that came out in June, July of last year, in terms of 75% of all workers are going to be impacted by AI, and it's going to have different variances based on what kind of industry and function you're in.
Right.
So,
and I think one of the biggest differences that AI is going to be impacting kind of your middle management knowledge worker, which is different than every other kind of technology leap always affected the industrial worker, right? It was always either the farmer or the factory worker, or the laborer who was affected by a change of technology instead of, knowledge workers obviously don't have a huge history, but they are a huge swath of the economy at this point. And knowledge work is one of the places where AI systems are really good at, right? So, there is possible disruption there. I would say really possible, but that's just me. I mean, we agree on the future of work and the idea that your industrial or labor skilled workforce needs some digital skills at this point to stay competitive. Is there anything else you think about the future of work that we should mention before we wrap up?
Yes. And I'm going to use the war in Ukraine to help emphasize my point, right?
Okay.
If you look at, the evolution of military warfare, and I don't care how far back you go, what you see is this vicious cycle or virtuous cycle, depends on how you look at the equation, around the adaption of new weapons. And of course, not just the new weapons, but the tactics associated with them.
Right.
Like, how do you have, a country with approximately a fourth of the standing army, certainly nowhere near this, the Marine, naval units and Air Force units go toe-to-toe with a country like Russia. And the Ukrainian war is really around kind of the first time that we've seen AI drones really level the playing field. Those technologies have been around for quite some time, but it was how they actually used them to sink, for example, like the Moskva, and almost completely deny the Russian Navy from operating in the Black Sea. How you haven't been able to see, the Russian Air Force essentially dominate, that particular theater. And certainly we can even talk in terms of, armoreds. That same type of practical application with these AI tools and how quickly they're coming to bear, right? I think it's really going to be incumbent upon organizations to kind of go through this next digital industrial revolution. And to your point, Matt, it's going to be incumbent upon not just your light industrial workers, but everyone inside the organization to be able to kind of articulate their value and how they're incorporating these new tools to improve what they're doing, or they're going to get lapped. And I think what you're going to see in this particular new industrial revolution as it relates to AI knowledge workers is the time for them to adopt these new, tools and technology is going to be much more condensed. They're not going to have years or decades to be able to adopt to these new tools and technologies, because all the reports that I'm seeing are saying, okay, by 2027 and by 2030 and by 2035, and it's only exponentially, it's going to impact them. So, we were kind of joking before this podcast about, what's coming out today with different versions of different tools. Probably even by the time this podcast goes out, there's probably going to be new tools and new versions coming out as we speak. And I don't think that's going to change. I think we're truly in that kind of Moore's Law conundrum. It's now more inclusive of all workers today. So,
yeah, honestly, I think, you're right. You don't have a lot of time. Throw out the fax machine to start working on your chatbot there, people. Unless you're in Japan.
They still have them in Japan. I'm telling you, it's wild. So.
Yeah, I mean, I work with a company right now called Kanji Accelerator to help people pass the kanji test to get work visas in Japan, which is interesting. But yeah, it's still a requirement there. So that's kind of a fun job on the side. Dan, I can't thank you enough for being on the show. It's great talk. I know we can talk forever, but obviously we can't. So maybe we'll have to see if it all comes true and have you back on the show again next year. And
thank you for listening to the Digital Marketing Masters podcast with your host, Matt Rouse. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us an honest review on your favorite podcast app. Be sure to check out Matt's book, Will AI Take My Job? And have a wonderful day.